Hey everyone, Pastor Bob here. It is January 7th, and we're diving into our series here in the book of Genesis. Today I want to look at this issue of how we read Genesis with ancient eyes. You know, for many years, most of my life actually, I've been a fan of history. I majored in history. I've been a tour guide at Gettysburg, and I've done some other tours around the world in places like Israel and in Turkey, taking people to England on John Wesley tours. I love inviting people into historical context when we read about famous people, when we read about important things like biblical history. There's nothing like getting on the ground, getting a feel for the place, getting a feel for the culture in which a lot of these great stories emerged, whether they're from the 1st century or the 8th century BC or even 100 years ago. We want to learn more about who these people were, because when we read what they wrote, then we can understand a little bit better about what they're talking about. And one of the great quotes that I often come back to is this one by a man named L.P. Hartley. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. That's very true. And when we read the Bible, we have to recognize that we are entering into a foreign country. And I feel like as a preacher, sometimes it's my job as a biblical interpreter to be kind of tour guide, to invite people into learning about that foreign country, learning the language, learning the culture, so that they can understand what the text means in its original context. So that's what we're going to look at today. And one of the images that I love for this is one that I found in a great book called Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes. I have a reference to that at the end of the slideshow if you want to pick up this book. I really recommend it because it really does have a lot to tell us about how we often misread Scripture. And the image that they use is that of an iceberg. You know, if we're looking at the ocean and we see the tip of an iceberg, we forget that 90% of an iceberg lies below the surface. And so they say that's the very same thing with a culture's worldview. Most of it is out of immediate view. I mean, we see the culture, we see how people live, we see the food, we hear the language, we recognize all of those things. But there are a lot of things that we don't see because we're not part of that culture. What's visible is only the tip of the iceberg. It's the stuff below the surface that often sinks the ship, however. If we fail to understand the stuff that we don't see, we often will misread a culture and we'll get it wrong. The most powerful cultural values, as the authors of Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes say, the most powerful values in a culture are the things that go without saying. There are certain things that go without saying. For example, in America, we don't have to go around telling people that we're very individualistic. That goes without saying. You know, if you're from Pittsburgh, where I'm from, it goes without saying you're probably a Steeler fan, and that's going to be a big part of your DNA. There are lots of things like that we see in our culture, and things that we don't even think about, but that other people will step over because they don't really understand the difference. So when we read the Bible, we want to recognize that when we look at the biblical text, we tend to only look at what's on the surface. We tend to read the Bible through our own cultural lenses, through our own assumptions. And I jumped ahead there a little bit, but we tend to read the Bible through 21st century Western eyes and through our own assumptions about what goes without saying. We want to oftentimes skip over the important parts and try to appropriate the Bible into our own time without recognizing what it was like for the people who first opened the scroll to read it. How did they understand it? What did it speak to them? What images did it use that were important to them? Those things that go without saying. So we have to want to go deeper when we're reading the text, and we have to want to understand the worldview and values of the people who wrote and read them for the first time. Once we understand what they understood, to the extent that we can, and we can't always get 100% there, but to the extent that we can understand it, the better we'll be able to understand how the text can affect us as well. So think about our own culture, our own Western culture, which, as John Walton calls in his commentary on Genesis, he says that we live in what's called a low context culture. We live in a very isolated, atomized kind of culture where we're very much structured around the individual. We recognize, for example, that people are fundamentally different from every other creature, fundamentally different from one another. We highly prize individualism. As I said, we, as Americans, we love rugged individualism, that idea that we can pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and make something of ourselves in the world. The world is our oyster, be all that you can be, which was the phrase that got me to join the Army, for example. All of that is part of our Western worldview. We believe that endemically, inherently, that people are masters of their own destiny, that they can choose their own goals and they can do whatever is necessary to achieve them. The world is your oyster. The world is vast, provides unlimited opportunities, status is achieved through achievement and competition. You just got to work harder. If you work hard enough, you'll make it. And you'll achieve what we call the American dream, which is, again, is one of those cultural icebergs. That means something different for everyone, but underneath there's this idea that we can all achieve greatness, wealth, whatever it might be. The history of humanity, we believe, is one of progress. Everything's always moving forward. For every problem, there's a solution, and that progress never needs to cease. For every illness, there's a pill. For every problem, there's an answer. There's an app for that, we love to say. There's a YouTube video that will tell us how to fix it. We are very much a culture that loves progress and individualism. But that was not biblical culture. Ancient Israel had a very different kind of context. In fact, in many ways, it's the polar opposite of what we believe inherently about ourselves. It was a very common culture, a high context culture, where everyone is seen in relation to someone else. It's a culture that's assumed by every member of society, and that identity is defined by the family or the group. We tend to say that we define our identity on our own. It's all coming from within us. Your truth is within you. But in the ancient world, and particularly in ancient Israel, your identity was defined by the family, by the group. Who your dad was, who your family is all very, very important. It's a very interdependent culture rather than an independent culture. As we read through Genesis, we're going to see the importance of family and how what happens in one aspect of the family systemically kind of works all the way down through that family. And the family of Israel, the family of Abraham, is going to be a classic example of this. It's all kind of bound together. It's about conformity to that family rather than independence. How are you supporting the family system rather than how are you standing apart from it? And so the individual is viewed organically and is connected to the physical world and to other persons. You can't be separated from those things. You are always part of your family. You're always part of your tribe. One of the things that we often say about this is that it's the 3 G's really dominate that ancient culture: gender, genealogy, and geography. If you're male, that's preferable. Female, not so preferable in that world. Genealogy, who's your daddy? And then geography, where are you from? That has a lot to determine. Now, we live in a very highly mobile culture, and people move all over the place. We've got a lot of cultural mixing in the midst of that. But in that world, you tended to stay very close to home. And so you're very much connected to those people and that place, and it's going to define you. Sandra Richter, in her work, The Epic of Eden, which I'm also recommending as a great background text for the study of Genesis, she says that Israelite culture was really characterized by 3 P's as well. I talked about the 3 G's. These are the 3 P's. That it's patriarchal, that everything revolves around the patriarch, around what's called the Beit Ab, or the father's house. And we'll talk more about this as we go through the series. You see how many times God, for example, presence of God is referred to as the father's house. It's about not just a physical place, but it's about that idea of gathering together in family, the family unit, the extended family. It's patrilineal. Your family line, your birth order, your inheritance means a lot. And the oldest obviously gets more than the younger. In fact, the sort of Israelite idea was that the elder son would inherit 2/3 of the property, the younger son 1/3. But notice how many times in the Bible the younger usurps the older. Jacob takes away the birthright of Esau, we see here in Genesis. Joseph is a favored son, even though he's the youngest among, one of the youngest, he and Benjamin, of all of Jacob's other 12 sons. So that patrilineal way of looking at things is also very important for reading Genesis. And then it's patrilocal. As we said, families tend to remain in extended groupings, and those groupings tend to grow because family survival was very important, farming, all the things that were required to maintain a family. That was true actually in our own country up until the early 20th century in many ways, until technology kind of takes over. You had to have large families in order to be able to sustain your life. So that was part of Israelite culture, very much endemic to it. There's also a lot of patron-client relationships. This is a very Godfather-like thing to think about. Wealthy patrons would serve and help those who were less fortunate, but then that less fortunate one would owe the patron something. Fealty, land, rent, whatever it might be. Sort of in that Godfather way, perhaps someday I will ask you to do a service for me, something like that. That patron-client relationship becomes very important, and we'll see that through Genesis 2. And then honor and shame as motivators. We tend to not really be a shame-based culture, even though within families that can be a thing. But from a cultural standpoint, honor and shame are not as important. I mean, think about the people in our culture who become famous for being infamous. We can be shameless at times. So it's a very different culture, and we'll see these things emerge as we read through Genesis. And literally, you're getting a different worldview, and we're going to talk about that this Sunday. The view of creation, for example, and the view of what the world is. The Israelite view is very different. I'm going to make the point on Sunday. If you showed people in ancient Israel a picture of the earth on the left as a globe, they would not have known what you were talking about. Their image of the world was that it was flat, it had a dome over it. Above that dome there were waters under the earth was flat and set up on pillars. All of that is kind of assumed in Genesis 1. God works with people where they are in that culture. But if we want to understand the creation narrative, how it's laid out there in the book of Genesis, we really need to understand how the ancients viewed cosmology, their understanding of the physical world. It's very different from ours. And that difference really plays into how we read the text as well, so that we can read it in a way that they would have read it and then understand what it means for us as we look at that image of creation. And we're going to go into that a lot on Sunday, so I hope you'll join us for that as we take a deep dive into Genesis 1. I'm going to argue that we've often read that in ways that are divisive rather than contextual. So we're going to take a look at that. I don't want to give away the store, though. I want you to be able to be here for that on Sunday. But some of the key questions we want to ask ourselves as we're reading through the biblical text. What did this text mean in its original cultural context? What did it mean, again, to those people who first opened the scroll? What are the universal truths it conveys? I mean, the Bible's obviously useful. Paul says this to Timothy, all Scripture is God-breathed and useful for teaching, reproof, correction. What is the universal truth, but also what are some things that are culturally bound that we want to understand what those cultural symbols mean? For example, when we talk about Genesis 1, the issue of Sabbath is massive. I would make the argument, in fact, that Genesis 1 is really about setting up the Sabbath as one of Israel's key practices. And it's also about worship and the temple. Again, we'll talk about that more on Sunday. What is culturally bound? What's the symbolism? What did it mean for them? Then what does it mean to us? And then to ask the question as we read the biblical text, what's below the iceberg? What goes without saying that would be helpful in interpreting this passage? And to do that, we need some tools to help us. And there are a number of tools out there that you can jump into that may be helpful. I've listed a few here. One of the books I mentioned earlier, Misreading Scripture with Western Eyes, by Randolph Richards and Brandon O'Brien. Really great book in helping you to kind of peel back the layers of the biblical text and to recognize some of our assumptions and how they cause us to often misread Scripture. The IVP Bible Background Commentary, Old Testament. People often ask me to recommend commentaries. I love these InterVarsity Press Bible background commentaries because they give you a lot of what's underneath the surface, a lot of what goes without saying when you're reading these texts. So you might want to pick up if you buy 2 commentaries, that 2-volume set is really just wonderful. And then one of my favorite books as an Old Testament survey is Sandra Richter's The Epic of Eden. I know some folks here at Aldersgate have studied that in the past, but if you've not read this book, it will really open the door for you to understand a lot of what's going on, not only in Genesis, but also in the whole Old Testament. Well, that's just a little preview of what's coming up on Sunday, but also some ways for you to think about reading the Bible, and in particular reading Genesis through those ancient eyes. Recognize that we are tourists when we come to the Bible, and sometimes we need a guide to help us. I hope you'll join me on Sunday as we jump into Genesis 1. We will see you then.